Welcome to the Film Florida podcast. I'm John Lux, and I'm the Executive Director of Film Florida. Before we get to our interview, please remember to subscribe, rate, and review the Film Florida podcast. If you're not already a member of Film Florida, please consider joining at filmflorida.org. If you like what you hear on the podcast, please consider going to our website and donating $20.22 for our 2022 fundraising campaign. We also have a Film Florida merchandise page. Visit filmflorida.creator-spring.com to purchase Film Florida t-shirts, sweatshirts, coffee mugs, and more. Welcome to a special edition of the Film Florida podcast. It's our 100th episode. Our guest today is Rob Hill. Rob's been a post-production audio mixer for decades, so we talked to him about his career and some of the many notable projects he's worked on. But Rob's also been the audio editor of the vast majority of episodes of the Film Florida podcast. So we're going to do a little retrospective about his time editing audio for us and get his thoughts on a few of the 100 episodes of the Film Florida podcast. Here's my conversation with Rob Hill. So welcome to this side of the Film Florida podcast, Rob, and thanks for helping us celebrate episode 100.
Wow, 100 episodes. Nice to talk with you, John.
Good to have you. So what's your origin story? Where did you come from?
Well, I grew up in Pennsylvania, and my dad worked as an engineer for the FCC. He was also a hi-fi buff, but not so much a music buff. He didn't have a big record collection, and the hi-fi wasn't on all the time, but I think it was really more the mechanics of it. He loved to wire up speakers throughout the house, and it was always a pretty nice rig, but I can't remember him sitting there listening to music a lot. But that certainly had to have been the start of my interest in audio. I just thought it was great. But I don't think he ever recognized my interest in it, because on my sister's 16th birthday, I was 14, he bought her a Webcore reel-to-reel tape recorder. And I'm like, hey, what are you giving it to her for? It was quite a rig for its day. It had detachable speakers and 2 microphones. We experimented recording all kinds of things. Radio dramas, birds outside, cars going by, you name it. But the thing that really hooked me was the demo tape that came with it. An amazing recording of a big band playing things like Hernando's Hideaway. I heard that and I thought, man, that is what I want to do. But my dad had other ideas and shipped me off to military school to make a man out of me. Shortly after that, my folks split up and I ended up moving with my mom to Maine. She really wanted me to go to college, but there weren't any schools that taught me what I wanted to know. You could go for electrical engineering and learn Ohm's law, but I was way too impatient for that. So, schools like Full Sail didn't even exist. So I got a job installing, among other things, background music systems like elevator music. Yeah, I know. But I learned a lot. I also read anything that was even remotely related to recording. And the rest of my time was spent running the PA for a rock band. One day I came into work and sitting on the shelf was a pro reel-to-reel deck and a couple of microphones. My boss said he was going to record his church choir. Long story short, by the time he knew what hit him, I had convinced him that no, he needed to build a recording studio. And I have just the place to do it, because my mother had bought a farmhouse with a gigantic barn. We could just knock out some of these horse stalls and have plenty of room. So I managed to convince my mom and my boss to build it in that barn.
Wow.
So he did. And then he just lost interest and walked away. So it left me with a recording studio in this barn for free. And I'm sure the darn thing was not up to code or anything. Probably the whole thing was illegal. So we were up and running, and one of the bands said they had an offer from another studio to produce them and shop them around to record labels. I said, great, but I'm coming with you. It's kind of a pivotal moment because sitting in the corner watching what's going on, and of course we went late into the night, and the engineer that was there at the time finally said, well, I've had enough, I'm going home. And so, okay, he leaves, but we still try and continue on. Mm-hmm. And then there's one point where the guitar player says, hey, I'd love to get some slap echo on my track. And the producer goes, geez, I'd love to, man, but I don't know how.
Mhm.
And so there's the kid in the corner pipes up, I do. So I literally went from sitting in the corner to the engineer's chair, and then I never left that chair for over a year.
Wow.
I don't know what happened to the other engineer. He must have quit or something because I never saw him again. And so the producer and I would just go in, record around the clock, sleep on the floor for at least a year and a half. Then when that fell apart, I went back to that barn again, got it up and running again with a different partner. And the band came in that actually did have a record deal, but they told the record company that they wanted to record it in my barn.
Mhm.
So the record company exec came up just to see, well, what's this all about? And when he came up, I just knew, I had a feeling that this was another opportunity. And it was, because not only were we able to do the album in the barn, he also offered me a job in their Boston studio.
Mhm.
So for a while, I was working in Boston by day and recording the album by night.
Wow.
After that, I closed the barn studio and moved to Boston. Oh, and by the way, a couple of months ago, I went back up that way and I decided just to drive by the place.
Mhm.
And I pulled in and I thought, well, I'm just going to take a picture or something. Then I said, oh, what the heck? I'll knock on the door. The guy that owns the place now was a super friendly guy, and he hadn't changed a thing in the barn.
Wow.
And we went into this room, and I mean, it looked like I had just left it 40 years ago.
Holy cow.
I know, there were wires hanging out, tape boxes on the shelves, same posters on the walls, everything. It was amazing. It really was. Anyway.
So audio is such a wide-ranging profession within the industry. How did you find yourself from music recording into post-production audio?
Well, during this time, the studio, Century 3, was building a production facility they called Centel. That is, until they found out that somebody else already had that name, and they changed it to Century 3 Teleproductions. So I was doing more and more audio for the projects they had there. But a project came along that was a production of Frank Baum's The Marvelous Land of Oz by a theatrical company out of Minneapolis. And stereo TV was just coming around.
Mm-hmm.
So they wanted this whole thing to be in stereo. They wanted to break some new ground with that. But that was a whole lot easier said than done back in 1981.
Right.
Video editing was coming along. That was all working. But locking audio machines to that technology was just starting. So we found a company that was based locally, because we knew that these things were problematic, to get the equipment to make them synchronize. So we chose a local one, and it's a good thing because we were blowing up their units and they were failing left and right. We had stacks of them around the control room. It was awful. So one of the things that you couldn't quite do yet was, even though you could synchronize machines together, it wouldn't be able to go into record at a number. Like if you set up an edit, at that edit point, cut to whatever, right? You couldn't do that in audio. You couldn't initiate record from a number. So you did it manually. So picture coming up to a scene, you cut away for a moment and you cut back. The issue was that would be different audio.
Yeah.
But in this case, the guys on the production end of it were recording everything to 24 track, and they had 10 of the prime characters all on radio mics. And they thought, well, let's assign a radio mic per character so we'll know which one goes to who, and it'll always be the same. But what they didn't do is they didn't assign it to a track on the multi-track. So on any given time when they started up again, these characters could be anywhere among these 10 tracks.
Oh, wow.
So couple that with, you have to punch in by hand. So the scene would come along, say, and you have a punch in at the next point, but the characters could all be somewhere else.
Wow.
So you had to set that up and you had to punch in. And of course, if you did too soon, you got to go back to the scene before it and fix it. It took 6 weeks, as long as you could stay awake. We just worked until we dropped every day. And finally got it done. But somehow I liked it. Adding the picture element to the audio was really pretty intriguing,
Yeah.
so all in all, that led to, okay, my audio path is going to be in post-production.
Well, and you mentioned something there, Rob, about how post-production worked. I mean, everybody knows that audio is digital now in computers and audio files, but give us a sense of what post-production audio was like in the 1980s. Talk about the execution of audio mixing.
Well, not everything was as bad as the Oz project I told you about. Probably the biggest hassle was that it was linear. In regular audio, if you wanted to add, rearrange, or delete something, you could physically cut the tape. With timecode, you couldn't cut the timecode. And when you were laying in your sounds on the multitrack, if you wanted to move a sound, you had to erase it from where it is now and lay it in again at the new location. Folks that worked in film could slide sounds relative to each other because they could potentially be on a separate reel and a separate machine altogether.
Okay.
They would have elements spread out over many machines, where a multitrack was just one. The other big difference was console automation. It was not widely available yet, so if there were a lot of fader moves on any given mix, you would determine where they were and put pencil marks next to the fader on the console. And when it came time to do a mix pass, you would have all hands on deck. Everyone has moves where they're responsible for in real time. Now that scenario was more likely in music mixing, because in music mixing, you're just laying down tracks to get the right level and sound and so forth, and you balance everything later. But in post-production, then you learn that you always have mixing in mind. So if you're putting in a background of birds behind something, say, you wouldn't put it in at full level, because in the mix, there's no way it's going to live at that level. So you put it in at a level that you think it will end up, always mixing in mind. That way you could cut down on fader moves during a mix. Film mixers called this pre-mixing. Plus, the role of the music engineer was changing. Traditionally, the producer would handle all the music side of things, and the engineer took care of all the technical side of things. But now, those two disciplines were merging, and now you had more of the producer-engineer in the music business, and my musical background wasn't strong enough to keep going in that direction, so the handwriting was on the wall.
And then, Rob, you moved from the Northeast down to Orlando in the late 1980s. What brought you to Florida?
Burnout. I was working really hard, never took a vacation, and being young in a college town like Boston meant there was quite a nightlife. I looked and felt very unhealthy, and I knew I couldn't continue like that. So I told my boss, Ross Sabella, a name you might know, that I was quitting. I said I didn't know what I was going to do, but this was killing me. Ross had just opened a post-production facility in Orlando. He said he didn't want me to quit and offered to move me to Orlando to work there. He said there isn't much going on. You can go there, chill out, and when you feel ready, you can come back.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, well, okay. 2 weeks later, I was on the balcony of the Sheraton Maitland in summertime. It was crazy hot, and I wondered, what the heck did I just do? Anyway, he was right. There wasn't much going on, but the stress from going full gas to dead stop was also pretty tough. I would have maybe a voiceover or two for the whole week.
Yeah.
So I took up bicycling again, got healthy, and probably saved myself.
Well, in your first decade in Florida, you worked on a number of television series and TV specials. Is there a project or two that sticks out in your mind as really special during that first, 10 years or so in Orlando?
Oh, yeah. When I took the job at the MGM Studios, that's when things really took off again. And one of the biggest productions I'd ever seen was working on the grand opening TV special. It was amazing. Never seen anything like that before. I think I was on the clock for 36 straight hours.
Wow.
Lots of great stories on that one. Another one would have to be the Muppets at Walt Disney World special. I remember while doing the music pre-record, with all the Muppet cast members in the studio at once, the control room was packed with people, and it was pretty chaotic. And my assistant tapped me on the shoulder and pointed behind me And there, sitting on a chair about 4 feet away, was Miss Piggy.
Wow.
And who'd ever seen Miss Piggy up close? What they had done is they brought in a new Miss Piggy for Frank Oz to approve. Is this, everything okay with this one type of thing? But that was just a moment that's like, wow, things have changed a lot. I mean, I wasn't a big Muppets fan necessarily, but you couldn't help but to be, impressed with that. So as the post-production kept going, one of the other unbelievably great things about it was that they hired Phil Ramone, the great Phil Ramone, to be music director. Now, Phil was a hero of mine for sure.
Yeah.
And so the plan was that Phil came down, sort of sit in on the edit, talk to everybody, and get a handle on what music was needed and what the score would be like. But the edit's kind of slow. So Phil hung out with us while we were doing sound effects for the segments that were ready or whatnot. And Phil was one of these people that could put you at ease instantly. And you really realize how perfectly suited he was to dealing with really hyper artists. I mean, after all, he dealt with Barbra Streisand for, so you saw where that came from. And he loved to tell stories. And as you can imagine, he had so many great stories, endless stories, and you wanted to hear them.
Yeah.
But, we're sitting there in the studio and he's just going on and on and on, and you're really enjoying it. And when you're looking over it like, gee, Phil, that's great, but we kind of got to get this job done here. And then he realized that the plan was, like I said, he would go back to New York, record and the score, bring it back, and then we'd put it in for the final mix. But it became apparent that there wasn't enough time. So he just looked at the Foley stage and decided, well, I'll just record the orchestra here. And I'm like, what? And before I knew it, things just started arriving. Music stands, headphones. Heck, we only had a handful of microphones because we were a Foley stage. You didn't need to do orchestras.
Right.
But it was amazing. He pulled it all together, and this whole orchestra showed up, and wasn't much elbow room at all on the stage. They even had to keep their instrument cases in a different room. That's how tight it was. But got it done. It was just amazing. I think that was the one and only time that an orchestra was ever recorded in the Foley stage.
Yeah.
But tragically, Jim Henson passed away a short time after that. His illness came on really fast.
Yeah.
And he was actually on the schedule to do a VO with me, I think, on the day he died. So the Henson folks were really kind enough to invite us to his memorial in New York at the Cathedral of St. John. We flew up on Walt Disney's old Gulfstream prop plane.
Wow.
And it's like a living room in there. So I take a seat and notice that there are a couple of gauges next to me. There was an altimeter and something else. And one of the crew says, well, this is where Walt used to like to sit. This was kind of his chair. And, you just thought, man, I am sitting in the king's chair.
Yeah.
Royalty. Royalty is right. And I mean, that was only the beginning, because we got limoed into the city, the cathedral. It came darn close to what you just saw with Queen Elizabeth, you know what I mean? Not quite everybody decked like that, but huge cathedral.
Yeah.
And we were in the VIP section. Now, mind you, we had only been working with the Muppets for a couple of months, maybe. I don't know, really short time. And we were in the very back of the VIP section, but nonetheless, I mean, it was a huge place. That's where they put us. And the ceremony was, well, it was just unbelievable.
Yeah.
Really unbelievable. You went from laughing to crying. And actually, you can see the whole thing on YouTube. But as you came in, everybody was handed a foam butterfly mounted on a rod. And at certain points during the ceremony, you would hold that rod up and shake it, and it would look like there were all these butterflies flying all over the audience. It was amazing. So you get through that, and then you get back on Walt's plane to fly back. I mean, that was one hell of a day.
Yeah.
And of course, there were loads of other projects we did. I mean, we did a few hundred episodes of the Mickey Mouse Club, and, you know, all the great talent that came out of that show. And the obligatory Christmas parade every year. I think with the exception of one particular editor, I don't think too many people really enjoyed doing the Christmas parade. It was just such a grind.
Yep. Rob, you and I met about a decade after you moved to Florida, when I moved to Florida in 1998. And so in those 10 or so years after that, you worked on a couple more television series, a number of made-for-TV movies and specials, Disney Feature Animation, a whole lot of ADR when I was with you there. Are there any stories from that period of time, either good or bad, that are worth sharing?
Oh, yeah, there are a couple that come to mind. One that you're very familiar with as well, John, is Elvis, the miniseries.
Yep.
It was probably everyone's worst nightmare, though. It was a high-profile special with an absolute firm air date, but everything along the way was taking a lot longer than it should. The shoot took longer, which made the edit start later, and then it continued much later than it should have. The air date was getting closer and closer, so the time for audio was compressed.
Right.
Couple that with a director that didn't seem to care. He didn't want to be mixing in Florida anyway, and was pretty difficult to work with. But we got through it, and it wasn't a whole lot of fun.
Yeah. My lasting memory from Elvis will always be it was 6 weeks, but in a sense, it felt like it was about 2 weeks because it was just, I don't know that we really left the studio very much. And in that 6 weeks, I lost 15 pounds because of the lack of eating and the overwhelming stress. So it was quite an endeavor.
Oh man, was it 6 weeks? I didn't remember that. It felt like an eternity. I remember they sent us out to go to the set at first, and that's when we
Right.
first got our tip off that things weren't going to go very well.
Yep.
And then when Richard and I went out to do a spotting session, do you remember this story?
Yep.
We went out to do that, and was his name Jim Sadwith?
Yep.
And so we come into the edit bay and meet with Jim, and we're going through the picture, and we're there to get notes on what he's feeling, what the background should be, or the mood of the scene, and so forth. But every time he'd come to the most obvious of things, say like a door close, he would turn to Richard and goes, "Now you're going to put a sound effect there, right?" And after a while, it got to be crazy. And Richard finally puts, "Look, I'm going to put a sound every time the door closes. Okay? Can we move on?" So there was another project that was kind of along these lines. And that was when Feature Animation was doing Mulan. So this was their first big full-length feature. So the folks in California wanted to save some money. So they said, well, why don't you do your temporary mixes there in Florida at our facility? And the editor just couldn't imagine that, well, anything could be done properly in Florida, period. But they insisted, and he set up a session to come over and we'll do a temporary mix and see how it works out. And even though our facility really looked like a film mixing place, there were real differences. And it wasn't something that we did, well, at all. But we set it all up and went through all the carrying on. And yeah, there were all kinds of technical issues, and the editor just had no patience for any of it. And the scene that they brought for us to mix was probably the most involved scene in the whole movie. And this is where there's a whole charge over a mountaintop and a big battle scene. And you know, it's just really, really, really busy. So we're struggling to get through it and so on. And at one point, he says, "Oh, stop. He says, "Rob, that line there, it doesn't sound good. Fix it. Can't you fix it?" Tried what I could do, tried EQing it and so forth, but you know, it wasn't recorded very well. I said, "Well, no, I really can't get it much better than that." And he just threw up his arms in disgust and so on. And so after that, we figured, well, that's probably the end of that. But California said, no, hang on a minute. We're not willing to give up on it just yet. Let's just do another session You can bring out whoever you want to mix it,
Okay.
and we'll give it another try. So they sent out a technical team ahead of time and ironed out a lot of issues and so forth. And these 3 Hollywood mixers show up, nice guys, and we go through this same big scene. And I'm sitting in the room because in case they needed anything, I'm familiar with our facility. And it gets to that same line, and he stops him again, and he goes, "That line there sounds terrible. Can't you fix it?" And the mixer just swivels around and looks at him and says, "Well, no, it's distorted," and turns back around. And that was the end of that.
Mm.
So actually, I felt a little vindicated after that one.
Yep.
And fortunately, things got a whole lot better with feature animation after that. We went on to record some dialogue for Lilo and Stitch and Brother Bear and a few other projects as well. And John, you mentioned ADR, and we certainly did a lot of ADR.
Yep.
There are lots of great stories from those sessions. But one in particular sort of sticks out for me as being pretty funny. We were doing ADR for the movie Lonely Hearts with John Travolta and Selma Hayek. And John, I don't know if he still does, but he had a home here in Florida, so he was considered local. At any rate, the session was booked in the evening. Most people had gone home, so it was me, an assistant, and an intern to take care of the session when he shows up. So in this movie, John was playing a real tough guy detective. And one of the cues, John's character grabs another guy by the lapels and throws him against the wall and gives him a, why yada type of delivery. So John looks at that and then he says, "Can somebody come out here and help me with this one?" And so the only person around that was available was the intern, because my assistant was taking notes and so on. And our intern at the time was kind of this big, slow-moving, kind of sleepy guy.
Mm-hmm.
So I said to him, "Mr. Travolta would like you out on the stage." And he looked kind of wide-eyed because he's a little bit starstruck, and a lot starstruck.
Yep.
So he went out onto the stage, and John said to come over and stand right next to him. And the intern had no idea what was about to happen. So we cue up the tape, we roll, and when it came time for him to deliver the line, John turned and grabbed the intern by the lapels, threw him against the wall, and delivered his line.
Uh-huh.
And immediately thereafter just went, "Are you okay? You okay?" So you can imagine what the intern thought, right?
Sure.
So after the session, he took him aside and said, "Now listen, you witnessed something that's really behind the scenes and really kind of privileged, and you can't tell anyone about it. You can't tell your wife. You can't tell your friends. Nobody can know what happened tonight. Got it?" And he was like horrified, because what would be the first thing you'd want to do if something like that happened, right?
I tell everybody.
"Hey, honey, guess what happened to me at work today?"
Yeah.
So that's one of the more entertaining stories.
Yeah. And then, Rob, in 2009, the company you and I worked for, Ideas, which had gone independent a few years earlier, we were still on the backlot of the Disney-MGM Studios. We moved from there to downtown Orlando in the middle of the Great Recession. And after a few false starts, the company built a state-of-the-art post-production audio mixing studio. And you were instrumental in designing the room. After working in a number of different mixing rooms in your career, what was it like to be able to help in the creation of that room that you would work in?
Well, it's every mixer's dream. And what we ended up with exceeded all expectations. But getting there, as you know, John, was painful.
It was challenging.
Very challenging. So we knew that we didn't have the expertise to build this ourselves, so we needed a designer. And I had always wanted to use this particular designer. It was somebody that I first met in my early years in Boston. At the time, he was doing maintenance for our studios, but he went on to build studios all over the world for some really famous people. He also was called upon for acoustic work at places like in Boston, the Kennedy Center, a beautiful building, but nobody could hear what was going on. He was called in to fix it. So he's more than qualified to build the room. And he probably agreed to do it because we were old friends, but be that as it may, I had known his work. I have total trust in what he was going to choose for equipment, how it should be laid out, and so forth. And all I asked was, I just don't want to see any speaker cones.
Mm-hmm.
In so many studios, you go in and there are all these ugly speakers piled up. And when you hide them, the sound just emulates out of the room. You don't see it as a point source.
Right.
So he comes down, does measurements, and goes away for a long time. It took forever to get the blueprints. And once construction started, there wasn't an inch to be moved anywhere. So everything had to be exact, right down to the centimeter. And one of the things that made it even more difficult was that I would be the go-between, because the designer wasn't around to pop in all the time and answer questions. So I'd get the questions from the contractors, get a hold of the designer. He would give a long explanation of why we could or couldn't do what the question was. And then the next day, I would have to convey that to the contractors. It just slowed things way down. And on top of all that, one of our technical staff, who laid out the rest of the building, was personally offended that we weren't going to use him to come up with this audio room. And he went out of his way to undermine practically everything. So all that added up to some serious misery. It took forever.
The biggest challenge I remember was realizing that the plans and the blueprints for the overall building, which you would have thought would be precise, were not really that precise. And so when we were designing a room that literally was down to the centimeter in specifications, and we would say, okay, we're going to have 12 feet and 3 3/4 inches, and then the construction crew would start to do it and say, well, we don't have 12 feet 3 3/4 inches, and there's a brick wall there. And so that was amazing to me to find out how imprecise original blueprints are of a building. And then I just remember, some of those questions you were talking about, where the construction people would ask us and we would think in our head, oh, that's a simple answer, that's a simple solution, but we'll go check with the designer anyway. Those were the ones that got most complicated. And then when they would come to us and say, oh, we have a really bad issue, we have a really big problem, we would say, oh my God, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And then we would go to our designer and come back, and he would be like, oh, that's no big deal. We just do this and this, and then we're fine. And it was like, by the end of it, my head was just spinning because I didn't know right from left and up and down. And the things I thought were easy were hard, and the things that were hard were easy. And it was just, it was an excruciating process, all in the middle. I do remember of right when I was having shoulder surgery. So through most of it, I remember being in a sling and barely being able to move because of the pain.
Yeah, that did nothing but compound that, huh? Yeah, it was. But when it was finished, boy, it was pretty spectacular.
It was amazing. It was an
Yeah.
amazing room. And then the first big job we did was a day-long ADR session for the film Dolphin Tale. And I remember the chaos leading up to that session, on how nervous we all were, because the room really wasn't ready for that type of a session. I remember having the best laid plans of, well, we'll do some simple stuff and we'll kind of work into some of this big stuff. And then, of course, you get a phone call from a major motion picture that needs an all-day ADR session. Of course, everybody says, we're going to do it. And so it was just the nerves of all of us outside the room, because we had no idea what was actually going on. I just remember that being the first big one that we do. What do you remember about that session?
Well, I remember we were all very apprehensive about this first session in there and how it's going to go. But let me just say this about ADR. Everybody knows what you're trying to accomplish when you do an ADR session, but it seems like every studio, every production company tends to go about it in a different way, and they're expecting different things to happen in the course of the session, and they never seem to want to convey that ahead of time. So you'll set up in a certain way that makes total sense to you, and you think everything's all set and you're ready to go. And then as soon as the session starts, then it's like, well, surprise. No, I'd rather have you do it this way. And the expectations are that it'll always be done in the way that they're used to doing it, which in their minds is the only way to do it. But they don't let you know that ahead of time. But in this case, we did know that they like to do it in a traditional Hollywood way of doing it, which means that the directors and the ADR director will sit on the stage with the talent. So knowing that, I set it up in a way that I thought was going to work just fine for them. And for the most part, it did. Now, what they're used to is working in a studio that ADR is all they do. The studio is laid out in such a way to accommodate that one purpose. In a normal studio that's not set up exclusively to do ADR, things are a bit different. They look kind of the same, but they're not. Mm-hmm. It's how the signal is routed and how the talkback works. You can do it, but it could be a little clumsier than what they're used to. But once we got that sorted out and we got rolling, everything was going pretty well. The only other thing that was adding to the stress was we had just built this really state-of-the-art control room where you could hear anything, right? And the rest of the studio area, we hadn't done anything to acoustically. Mm-hmm. We figured we'd do the control room first, and then we'll see how things go, and we'll do acoustic treatments to the studio later.
Right.
Consequently, anytime there would be a motorcycle or a helicopter go over or a siren, you could hear it. Mm-hmm. And you'd have to stop. And they'd turn and look at you like, oh, what the heck? So yeah, it was a long day, and I was pretty happy once we finally got it all finished.
A few years after that, Dolphin Tale 2 came back to the studio, so they couldn't have hated it too much. And by that time, we had been able to do a little bit of work on the recording side of things, so it wasn't nearly as problematic.
Oh yeah, for sure. Once we knew what they were expecting and how they like to work,
right.
Yeah, we were much better set up for it the second time.
Yeah. So Rob, in the last few years, you've had some great opportunities to work in other studios as well. You were the sound designer and sound editor on the documentary Woman in Motion, which is a great Florida-based film. Talk about where the final mix was done on that one.
Well, a little backstory. When I first met Todd Thompson, the director, I told him that I was working from home and could only provide him with a stereo mix. Mm-hmm. At first, I think he was thinking that that's all he needed. But when I told him that at some point, somebody's going to ask for a 5.1 mix, so he might as well do it right away. And in order to do that, we would have to take it someplace to mix. And he thought for a moment and then said, well, how about Skywalker Ranch? And I laughed because Skywalker is one of the finest facilities in the world. Would they even talk to us? But he went for it and found out that they try hard to accommodate independent films as much as they can and cut us a great deal. We then started to talk with the mixer who would be working with us. His name, no lie, is Luke. And in the end, we got to go out there for 4 days and mix. But for anyone that doesn't know, Skywalker Ranch is a 2,500-acre valley in Northern California owned by George Lucas that is the most incredible facility you can ever imagine in a very, very beautiful environment. You go there, you stay there, you eat there, and you work there. And although there are lots of other projects going on, you never feel like you're crowded or bumping into anybody else. And they're just such great people. They make you feel like you are the only thing that matters. And it was great. I wanted to chain myself to a tree so I'd never leave. It's just an amazing place.
Well, and now you're working on another cool project. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I'm working with Todd on another movie called Prefab. And Prefab is about the Quarrymen. The Quarrymen were the early Beatles.
Right.
And as Todd likes to put it, this is the last Beatles story to be told. Mm-hmm. So it chronicles their really early days when they were a skiffle band, and it centers on the drummer, Colin Hanton. And Colin was truly their first drummer. It wasn't Pete Best, that was later. But Colin was there right from the very beginning. So you can imagine what the story is, kind of. He didn't end up being in the Beatles. But the movie has a really nice twist at the end that's pretty unexpected, at least by me. And the idea is, given the subject matter, wouldn't it be great to do the final mix at Abbey Road?
Mm,
Sort of to come full circle in the story.
sure.
So we're working on that. It may or may not happen. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, fingers crossed that that actually works out. Now, Rob, as I mentioned in the open, you've also been the audio editor of the Film Florida podcasts for close to 90 of the 100 episodes to this point. With this being our 100th episode, I wanted to have you on, in addition to talk about your career, but to talk about that. You started editing the podcast in season one. Do you remember your first impressions of the podcast?
Well, at first they were all done over the phone, and they were kind of hard to listen to. We hadn't yet gotten used to listening to Zoom calls, but the Zoom calls were much better than the telephone, and so that improved a bit. But really, it all came down to who the guests were. If they had something to say and you were interested in what they were saying, you had a winner. If not, I guess they just click on the next one. But evidently, people were interested in it, so that's great.
Yeah. But actually, the idea of a podcast was something that I had in my head dating back to the days when you and I were at Ideas. I wanted to do an Ideas podcast, but just couldn't get my arms around what it was and who would be on it and what we would talk about it and where it would go. And obviously, as time has gone on, doing podcasts has become much more mainstream and much easier to do. But so yeah, I was glad that we were able to launch it, but quickly learned that I needed help, and so thank God that you were around to help me. I mean, did you ever imagine we'd get to 5 seasons and 100 episodes?
Well, I have to admit I didn't give it much thought, but 100 episodes is pretty amazing. I guess it reinforces just how many people have been involved in productions in Florida, and there probably could be 100 more, and we still wouldn't have covered everybody.
Yeah. And I mean, people I remember asking me in season one, is there going to be a season two? And I would shrug my shoulders and say, I'm not really sure. And I think we're still saying the same thing. I mean, I have people asking if we're going to go beyond season five, and it's still kind of a shoulder shrug. I don't know. We'll figure it out when we get the end of season five.
Yeah, I suppose so.
And I mean, not to put you on the spot here, but has there been an interview or two along the way that you learned something interesting?
Well, the podcast with Rich Rodman taught me what a DIT is.
Which, of course, 25 years ago wasn't even a job in the industry.
Yeah, that's true. But he was just a wealth of information about how it's being done, what's coming up in the future. It was just a really, really informative podcast.
Yeah, I find myself in doing the research ahead of all the interviews. I don't think there's been a single interview that I didn't learn something out of, which is, either in the research or actually talking to the person. And I mean, I try not to have too many surprises when I'm interviewing people, but there are still things that people say that I think to myself, wow, I had no idea that was coming, or that happened in their life or their career. So it's been really informative to me, and hopefully somebody else is listening to it and getting something out of it. But at least I am, if nothing else. Now, also, I mean, have there been any interviews that you found particularly interesting?
I always like hearing stories from people that were involved with some of the projects that I worked on. It's always great to hear somebody else's take on that. Plus, everybody loves a little behind the scenes story.
Yep.
It's almost like seeing an outtake or something to get a little behind the scenes story, and I always enjoy those.
When we first started the podcast, I think part of the thing that I wanted to hit on was some of the behind the scenes stuff, some of the stories behind the stories. Look, every podcast, we've done 100 of them now, and they're kind of like kids. You never want to say you like any of them more than others, but some of them resonate a little bit more. I mean, obviously, with the analytics, we can see some of the episodes, more people listen. But I mean, some of the ones that I look back on and still kind of in awe. I mean, and Glenn Roberts from the Department of Defense, learning about how the entertainment industry has to interact with the Department of Defense in terms of making sure that the film or television series is portraying the military correctly. Talking to Jay Rowe from HBO and Scott Edwards from Fox Entertainment was really, really cool. I mean, Jay has been kind of a hero of ours in Florida for many years because he's been so supportive of our industry. I enjoy talking to the legislators when we've had those on in the past, because a lot of people see legislators just from the mailers, the press releases, the social media posts, and I like to be able to talk to them on a more personal level. When we had Joyce Gilliard from iSafe TV, just talking about the incident that happened a few years back, where there was a death on set because of lack of safety, and then the organization that she started to help the entire industry be safer on set was really great. And I mean, you mentioned Todd Thompson. I mean, we had Todd and Joy on to talk about the Highwaymen, which they're working on. So that's great. And I've always found it interesting, the kind of some of the weaving of stories and people that we've had. I mean, I had Boris Malden on, who worked with us when we did Sheena for a couple of seasons, and then for better or for worse, Boris brought us Elvis. So I mean, seeing how some of those people kind of weave through different periods of our careers. So yeah, it's there have been a lot of interesting stuff. And I mean, I'm too close to the whole thing, but people tell me they enjoy the podcast, and you've heard almost every episode. I mean, I think it's because it's successful because of the stories, right?
Oh, yeah, it's all about the story. But there is one other thing that, as an editor for this, that I try and do. It's one thing when somebody's telling a story face to face. It's quite another when you're going to have it in a podcast. It has to flow a little bit better, and we all do our you knows and ums and ahs and so forth. And on a podcast, it's much easier to listen to if you don't have all those things in it, or pauses that are way too long and rambling sentences that really could be tightened up. So I do my best to try and edit that to not really take out any content, but just make it a lot easier to listen to.
Yep. So Rob, last question is kind of the obligatory one. I mean, I've been in the industry for more than 25 years. You've been doing it much longer than that. Of all the areas in the industry, I think people know less about post-production audio than any other area of the industry. That's just my perception. Maybe we need to talk about it more. Maybe that's part of the problem. But if someone is listening that didn't really think about post-production audio, but now is interested, what advice do you have for them as they look at your job and say, that sounds pretty cool, I want to do more of that?
Well, there are two very big advantages to getting into post-production sound these days. One, of course, is the computer. Anybody with a computer can start doing some rudimentary sound work. The other is all the educational opportunities. There are several really good universities teaching great courses in audio. So if you can manage to go to one of those schools, that's a terrific foundation and a head start. But really, like so many other people that have been on the podcast have said, you've really got to be around. You've got to do it. And the way to do that is if you can connect with somebody else, say a young filmmaker that's just starting out, or an independent film that doesn't have the budget for a major studio, you can start working with them, and one thing will lead to another. Everything you do, the people you work with, will lead to other jobs. Now, the bad thing about having a computer and working from your bedroom is you're not around other people. When you were in a facility, you were around other editors, other audio people. There were a lot of other people to chat with and learn from. So those are the advantages you have, and a good way to go. But the bad news is that means there are also a whole lot more people actually trying to do this work. So it's tough, but if you enjoy it and if you have enthusiasm about it, that will show and jobs will come. But you do have to work at it.
So Rob, you and I have known each other for close to 25 years now. I've always enjoyed your work, and I've also enjoyed our many conversations about your Boston Bruins and my Chicago Blackhawks, although you have the upper hand very much so right now. I appreciate you being on the podcast to talk about post-production audio and your career, and of course, your work on the Film Florida podcast the last couple of years.
Well, thank you very much, John. It's been my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Film Florida podcast. For more information about Film Florida, go to filmflorida.org or visit our social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. If you're not already a member of Film Florida, please consider joining at filmflorida.org. If you like what you hear on the podcast, please consider going to our website and donating $20.22 for our 2022 fundraising campaign. Check out the Film Florida merchandise at filmflorida.creator-spring.com, and please remember to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast.